She was ruined by a single glance long before she understood it had chosen her. In the Tudor court, nothing was spoken plainly, yet everything was decided in whispers sharp enough to cut a life apart. You'll see how a woman rose without wanting to, fell without deserving to, and vanished without a sound. Tonight, HT, you will walk beside her through the silence that swallowed her whole. So, before you feel comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Only if your heart truly wants to. If you do like it, leave a little comment letting me know what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights. Adjust the pillow to fit your head. Maybe turn on a fan to create a relaxing atmosphere. And let's begin this journey together tonight. If one were to stand quietly in the corridors of a Tudor household, watching the rhythm of daily life move past in layers of silk, murmurs, and bowed heads, one might notice a woman who did not quite belong to any defined place. She walked behind the noblewomen, but ahead of the servants. Acknowledged, but never formally introduced. Visible, yet unnamed. Her presence slipped through the structure of the household, like a draft beneath a door. Felt, noticed, and never spoken of directly, in a world where every role was written into custom, law, and scripture. Hers existed only because people refused to put words to it. She held no legal claim, no seat at the family table, no authority over servants, and no protection should opinion shift against her. Yet the house adjusted itself around her in subtle ways, a changed seating arrangement, a redirected glance, a door left half open when she passed. Everyone understood who she was, though no one was willing to say it aloud. Silence gave her shape, and that same silence warned her that she could vanish from the household as easily as she had entered it. The ambiguity of her position was not accidental. It was convenient, as long as her existence floated between categories. No one was obligated to defend her, define her, or shield her. She could be dismissed without explanation, blamed without proof, remembered without a name. The man who favored her did not have to justify her presence. The woman who feared her did not have to accuse her. The servants who observed her could whisper without consequence. She lived in a space where recognition was constant, but legitimacy was impossible. Nothing about her place was stable. Every look she received carried meaning. Some cautious, some calculating, some quietly hostile. The household behaved as though her status could be altered by the simple shift of a man's attention. A single day of disfavor might erase months of quiet acceptance. A new arrival at court, younger or more charming, could turn her from a tolerated presence into an inconvenient burden. She existed inside a system that depended upon her remaining both essential and deniable. And still, she stayed, not because the position was safe, but because it was one of the few ways a woman of modest birth could step beyond the boundaries set for her. She understood the risks. She understood the glances. She understood that every privilege extended to her was borrowed, conditional, and subject to sudden recall. Yet she also understood that without this unspoken role, she would be indistinguishable from countless women whose lives passed without a mark. The unnameable space she occupied reflected the contradictions of Tudor society itself, a world obsessed with order, yet dependent on its own exceptions. Officially, morality was strict, and roles were fixed. Unofficially, entire households shifted around these quiet intrusions, accommodating a position that everyone pretended did not exist. Her survival depended on her ability to navigate this contradiction with precision, never stepping too boldly, never fading too completely. There was danger in simply being noticed, and danger in not being noticed enough. Every interaction required calculation. Every expression could be misread. Every kindness could be interpreted as ambition. She learned to keep her hands still, her eyes lowered, her steps measured. She learned when to speak and when to disappear. She learned to carry the weight of a role that had no name, no rules, and no protection. What made her position most precarious was that it relied entirely on perception. She could not point to a document, a ceremony, or a title that proved she belonged. Her value existed only in the mind of another person, and minds were easily altered by jealousy, boredom, or a whispered suggestion. She was a figure painted on mist, visible for a moment, dissolved the next. And yet, the household depended on her more than it admitted. She absorbed desires that could not be acknowledged, eased tensions that could not be spoken, and embodied the contradictions that polite society preferred to ignore. She was both central and disposable, essential and unwanted, present and denied. Her story existed in the margins of other people's lives, never allowed to stand on its own. She understood, perhaps more clearly than anyone, that silence was both the ground beneath her feet and the precipice beside her. The very thing that made her position possible could undo her with a single shift in tone, a single raised eyebrow, a single murmured comment drifting through the corridors she walked each morning. Everything she held depended on the fragile balance between recognition and denial. Yet within that balance, shadows began to tighten around her place in the household, and somewhere behind closed doors, a quiet observation was already turning into something far more dangerous. The first glance inside the Tudor court did not arrive with fanfare or clarity. It slipped quietly into a room filled with rustling sleeves, calculated smiles, and the subtle sound of silk brushing stone. A young woman might sense the shift before she fully understood it. An alteration in the air, a change in the direction of attention, a pause that lasted a heartbeat too long. In that single moment, the balance of power surrounding her reoriented itself, though she remained motionless among the other ladies, unaware of how quickly her life had begun to tilt. The men who shaped the court's hierarchy did not need words to express authority. Their choices, especially those made casually, even carelessly, revealed everything. A raised eyebrow, a redirected gaze, a slight softening of posture toward one woman rather than another became signals that reverberated through the entire room. The court had learned to interpret these cues with meticulous precision. A woman newly noticed did not yet recognize the dangerous privilege contained in such attention, but everyone else did. Power spoke through silence long before it declared itself openly. Youth and beauty played their part with a cruelty that felt almost inevitable. A fresh face, unmarked by scandal or disappointment, carried a kind of radiance the court understood too well. It was not innocence they valued, but possibility. The younger she was, the more easily her story could be written over her. A pretty expression, a graceful bow, a soft voice. These qualities became invitations she never meant to extend, interpreted through the desires of men who saw her first as an ornament, then as an opportunity. Her appearance, which had meant so little to her life before court, suddenly became evidence of a fate she had not chosen. The glance that fell upon her seemed harmless in isolation. No one spoke, no one pointed, no one announced anything. Yet the court felt the tremor immediately. A woman standing beside her might stiffen. A servant might look twice before lowering his eyes. A married lady, experienced enough to read the signs, might adjust her position to distance herself from what could become a brewing complication. The court did not need confirmation. It needed only direction. The king's gaze had supplied that. To the young woman herself, the moment could feel flattering, confusing, or simply strange. She might tell herself she imagined it, that the king looked at everyone in the room. But the court's reaction revealed the truth long before she allowed herself to acknowledge it. A small shift in how courtiers greeted her, a sudden politeness from men who had never noticed her before, an unspoken tension in the conversations she walked past. All of these were signs of a transformation unfolding around her without her consent. Such attention was never a compliment. It was a judgment. It assessed her value, not as a person, but as a potential participant in a system of desire and ambition maintained by those far more powerful. Her beauty, her youth, her presence. These became tools others used to calculate their own advantage. She might feel the pull of this new awareness, a mixture of fear and curiosity. But she had little control over what would happen next. The king's glance had placed her in a position she could not step away from without raising suspicion. The court thrived on possibility, and her possibility became a kind of currency. Men speculated quietly about how the king's interest might reshape alliances. Women whispered about whether she would rise or fall, and how quickly. Some predicted her ascent, others prepared for her downfall. No one asked what she wanted. The court was not a place that granted young women the luxury of desire. It evaluated them based on usefulness, compliance, and the ability to absorb attention without collapsing under it. In the weeks that followed, her life began to change in ways so subtle she might not immediately understand them. A slightly finer fabric was offered for her gown, a seat marginally closer to influence, a question asked by someone who had once ignored her. These small adjustments seemed inconsequential, yet they formed the outline of a path she had not intended to walk. Those who understood the court saw it clearly. She had been noticed. And notice was the first step toward being chosen. But being chosen was never safe. The glance that lifted her above anonymity also exposed her to scrutiny sharper than anything she had known before. Every gesture she made could be interpreted as ambition. Every smile could be exaggerated into seduction. Every silence could be twisted into calculation. Her world became a mirror turned back against her, reflecting not who she was, but who the court needed her to be. She might have believed that attention brought opportunity, that being seen gave her a chance to step beyond the boundaries of her birth. Yet the truth lingered beneath each polished exchange. The glance that set her apart had also marked her. She became a focus of fascination, envy, and quiet resentment. A woman touched by royal interest belonged no longer to herself, but to the dangerous machinery of courtly perception. And so the first glance, so brief, so deceptively gentle, became the hinge upon which her fate turned. She might not yet understand the scale of what had shifted, but the court did. It had watched this transformation countless times before. It knew where such stories ended. That single moment of attention carried more power than any spoken decree. And within the crowded halls, admiration had already begun to sharpen into expectation. For somewhere among those watchful faces, the first murmur was preparing to take root. Being chosen inside the Tudor court was never the victory it appeared to be. The moment a woman stepped from obscurity into the fragile glow of royal favour, she also stepped into a space where her safety thinned under the weight of expectation. What others envied as privilege, she soon learned to recognise as something far more volatile. Favour within the court was not a solid foundation. It was a shifting surface that moved with the king's attention, influenced by moods, politics, and the whispers of those who resented her sudden ascent. The attention she received felt overwhelming at first. Courtiers spoke to her with increased politeness, offering smiles edged with calculation. Servants observed her more carefully, reading her reactions as though they were deciphering a hidden message. Even those who had once ignored her began adjusting their behaviour, stepping forward with kindness, designed for their own benefit. In that world, her new position demanded gratitude she did not feel and composure she was not prepared to maintain. Yet she soon discovered that being chosen did not grant her power over anything that happened next. The king's interest was not something she could decline. Her own desires mattered far less than the unspoken decisions forming around her. If she attempted to distance herself, it could be interpreted as defiance. If she accepted too easily, she might be judged as ambitious or morally suspect. She walked a narrow line defined not by her intentions but by the interpretations of others. interpretations that could shift at any moment. Every gesture she made became evidence of something. A lowered gaze might suggest humility or guilt. A polite smile might be read as encouragement or manipulation. Even silence carried weight. The court, trained to find meaning in subtleties, rarely allowed her the luxury of innocent action. She began to realize that her life was no longer her own. Her role, unofficial, unacknowledged, yet unmistakably enforced, was taking shape around her with an intensity she could not control. The most disquieting truth was that the king's favor offered no guarantee of protection. It was temporary by nature, subject to the unpredictability of desire. A passing frustration, a political shift, or a new face arriving at court could weaken her position in an instant. She lived under the constant shadow of replacement, aware that her influence, however slight, could evaporate without warning. What had lifted her from anonymity might just as easily cast her back into it. Or worse, push her into scandal. Attention, which others imagined to be a blessing, quickly revealed itself as a threat. The more her presence was acknowledged, the more vulnerable she became. Women who had once regarded her with indifference now watched her with suspicion or resentment. Their husbands' behavior toward her was judged sharply. Their sons' glances were scrutinized. Their own positions felt endangered by a young woman who had gained notice through circumstances she never intended to create. The court was a place where jealousy sharpened itself quietly and persistently, taking shape behind composed expressions. Men, too, viewed her differently. Some sought proximity, not out of admiration, but out of strategic calculation. Aligning themselves with someone touched by royal favor could be advantageous. For a time, their loyalty, however, shifted easily if her influence waned. Others avoided her entirely, wary of drawing attention to themselves or appearing complicit in her rise. She learned to see the patterns, the way alliances formed around her like shadows, and the way they disappeared the moment danger approached. She felt the weight of expectation grow heavier with each passing day. She was expected to be pleasing but not eager, graceful but not bold, visible but never too visible. She was to fill the role constructed for her without stepping beyond it. Any deviation, however small, risked becoming the spark for a whisper that could unravel everything. The constraints tightened slowly, like threads pulled taut around her until movement became difficult. In private, she confronted the harsh truth that her position lacked structure, rights, or certainty. She had no legal standing, no formal title, no protection through marriage. She existed in an arrangement sustained entirely by perception and silence. And silence was fragile, once broken. Once someone decided to speak, or hint, or imply, she could be undone by little more than collective agreement that she no longer belonged. What frightened her most was realizing how quickly fear replaced admiration in the eyes around her. As she became more favored, people learned to blame her for the king's choices, for shifts in his attention, for decisions she had no part in. Influence was imagined where none existed. Control was assigned to her, even though she had almost none. She became both a symbol and a scapegoat, carrying the weight of a power she did not wield. Thus, the safety she once associated with being chosen dissolved into something far more precarious. She understood, slowly and painfully, that the court valued her only as long as she served its unspoken needs. The moment she threatened its balance, by existing too confidently or too vulnerably, she risked becoming the court's next cautionary example, whispered about long after she disappeared. The favor she received bound her more tightly than any obligation she had known before, and as admiration turned into scrutiny, she sensed how narrowly she walked between acceptance and ruin. Somewhere beyond the polished rooms, a new tension was already gathering, waiting for the right moment to unravel her fragile standing. The moment a woman in the Tudor court realized she had been chosen was never the same moment everyone else realized it. For her, the shift arrived slowly, creeping around the edges of her awareness, like a change in the weather. But for those watching, courtiers trained in interpreting every flicker of expression, it was immediate. They sensed the exact second a line had been crossed. The instant her place in the court transformed from ordinary presence into something far more precarious. A glance from the king might have lasted only a heartbeat. Yet for the court, that heartbeat marked a boundary she would never again be able to return from. Once the moment occurred, there was no undoing it. The court did not allow such transformations to fade or be forgotten. A woman who caught the king's eye, even briefly, carried the evidence of that attention like a mark pressed onto her skin. It followed her through corridors, gardens, and chambers, no matter how carefully she tried to conceal her reactions. Even if she pretended not to notice the shift, others certainly did. Their behavior revealed the truth long before she dared acknowledge it herself. People began watching her more closely, not openly, but through the subtle observation that defined Tudor life. Servants lingered a moment longer when handing her a cup. Ladies in waiting measured her with quiet calculation. Men adjusted their posture when she entered a room, seeking alignment or distance depending on their ambitions. The court became a vast, breathing organism, and she was suddenly a focal point in its intricate network of attention. The danger lay in the fact that she could do nothing to halt or slow the transformation. The glance that elevated her had also confined her. She could not protest without appearing ungrateful or naive. She could not express hesitation without implying guilt or resistance. And she could not embrace the moment without signaling ambition, a trait the court tolerated only when it served its own purposes. Thus, she learned quickly that standing still was not neutrality. It was simply another way to be interpreted. The moment of being chosen also created a silence around her, one that separated her from the women she once moved among without notice. They watched her carefully, adjusting their tones and expressions as they gauged what her new place might mean for them. Some reacted with pity, recognizing the burden beneath the surface of favor. Others responded with sharpened suspicion, perceiving her as a threat to their sons, husbands, alliances, or influence. In a court built on hierarchy and delicate balance, her sudden rise disrupted far more than she understood, and with disruption came whispers. They were never spoken in her presence, yet she could feel them shape the air around her. A glance exchanged between two noble women, a hushed laugh in the gallery. A servant's eyes avoided hers too quickly. These quiet signals revealed more than any spoken accusation. They meant that judgment had already begun. Judgment not based on her actions, but on what others expected her actions might become. The whispers emerged in stages. At first, they questioned her origins, searching for flaws or improprieties that might explain why she had been noticed. When those attempts failed, the court invented possibilities, weaving narratives out of gestures she never meant to offer. A smile held a moment too long became evidence of intent. A dull expression was read as calculation. Even her fear could be twisted into cunning if the court needed it to be so. The truth mattered far less than the story others decided to tell. The hardest part for her was realizing how little control she possessed. She could not hide, for hiding looked guilty. She could not appear too confident, for confidence invited accusations of manipulation. She could not remain unchanged, because change was now expected. Every path she might take curved back toward the same truth. The king's glance had marked her, and the court intended to watch closely to see what would come of it. She began to feel the pressure in small moments. The pause before someone addressed her, the sudden hush when she entered a room, the sense that every movement she made was recorded silently by those with something to gain or lose. The king's attention might have been fleeting, but its consequences were not. It reshaped her surroundings, forcing her into a narrative written by people who had never spoken to her directly. And all the while, the whispers continued to grow. They were gentle at first, like the distant rustle of leaves. But gentle whispers in the court were rarely harmless. They gathered strength as they passed from person to person, gaining shape and intent. She did not need to hear them to sense their arrival. Their presence lingered in the atmosphere. Thin, sharp, unavoidable. That single moment of attention lifted her above anonymity, yet anchored her to a danger she could not yet measure. Around her, the court recorded every detail, preparing itself for the story it expected her to fulfill. And in the deep hush behind polished doors, the first true whisper of her undoing had already begun to form. The path that carried a young woman from the lower ranks of a Tudor household into the orbit of male power never appeared as a single, decisive step. It unfolded quietly, almost invisibly, beginning in the spaces where servants moved, and conversations drifted without drawing attention. A girl who entered the court as a lady's attendant, a seamstress, or a low-ranking companion might believe her role was simple and her life predictable. She tended to fabrics, poured wine, accompanied her mistress, and learned to walk softly through corridors designed to remind her of her modest station. Nothing about her daily routine suggested that she would one day be pulled into the dangerous center of courtly influence. Her rise did not begin with ambition, it began with proximity. The court was built on layers of intimacy. Proximity to wealth, proximity to beauty, and proximity to power. A young woman positioned near nobility absorbed the nuances of behavior expected among those above her. She learned their silence, their posture, their way of moving through rooms as though they belonged to them. These skills, adopted gradually and without conscious effort, made her more noticeable than she realized. To be quiet, attentive, and composed was to be useful. To be useful was to be watched. Her first steps upward might come as small privileges, being chosen to accompany a noblewoman on an outing, receiving a slightly finer fabric for her gown, and being trusted with a task that required discretion. None of these gestures was grand, but they marked her as someone capable of navigating delicate spaces. Those above her took note. Those beside her felt the shift. And she, caught between gratitude and uncertainty, carried on without understanding how these subtle movements were drawing her toward a center she had never intended to enter. Men noticed her next, not because she sought attention, but because the court trained them to assess every woman near the spheres of influence. They were adept at reading modesty as a lure, quietness as virtue, and vulnerability as opportunity. Her presence, once unremarkable, acquired meaning she never intended to give it. She might be invited to serve wine during a gathering or to assist a lady who was seated near the king. These tasks seemed harmless, yet they placed her within reach of those whose choices could alter her life without warning. Once, a man of status began to perceive her as more than a servant. The path she walked narrowed. She could not refuse his attention. Refusal would be seen as insolence. She could not welcome it. Acceptance would be interpreted as ambition. She existed in a tense space where every gesture risked misinterpretation. The court structure offered her no script for self-preservation. What protection she had depended entirely on the whims of those who noticed her. Being drawn into the center of male power did not grant her authority. Instead, it stripped away the little freedom she once possessed. The tasks she had performed with ease now carried weight. Her movements were observed. Her proximity to powerful men became a source of speculation. Even those who knew her from before treated her differently, some with envy, others with suspicion, and many with the cold detachment of people predicting a storm. Their responses revealed a truth she had not yet fully understood. She was stepping onto a path with no gentle end. The deeper she was pulled inward, the more dangerous her role became. She was expected to maintain composure, even as the boundaries around her tightened. She must appear grateful. Though gratitude offered no safety, she must appear calm, though fear pressed at her from all sides. She must adapt quickly, learning rules she was never taught, and performing duties she had never imagined herself capable of fulfilling. Every moment pushed her further from the life she had known. Yet the court offered her no guidance, no warning, and no mercy. Her ascent was not a climb, but an absorption. She did not rise by stepping upward. She was drawn forward by the vacuum created when powerful men desired something they could not name openly. She became part of that void, someone easier to shape than a noblewoman, easier to discard than a wife, and easier to blame when the balance of the household shifted. The privileges she gained were thin and temporary, overshadowed by the constant threat that her presence could be turned against her at any moment. And yet, once she entered this sphere, escape became nearly impossible. A woman elevated by male desire could not simply return to her previous life. She had witnessed too much, been seen too clearly, and become too entangled in the delicate tensions of the court. The very attention that had lifted her now held her in place, making her both necessary and expendable. The path she walked was narrow, steep, and unforgiving. It offered glimpses of luxury, but denied stability. It provided visibility, but withheld protection. And every step forward brought her closer to a future shaped not by her own choices, but by the silent decisions of those who watched her with interest, sharpened by power. Her rise was built on movements so quiet she hardly recognized them as a transformation. Yet with each subtle shift, she was carried deeper into a world that offered no safe retreat. Somewhere behind her steps, the first outline of her confinement had already begun to take form. Legal order shaped the foundation of Tudor households long before any woman entered them. A wife's role was predetermined by lineage, negotiation, and obligation, creating a position that existed independently of her personality or desires. She stepped into a structure designed to uphold alliances, control property, and secure heirs. Every aspect of her presence, how she managed servants, how she presented herself in public, how she maintained the dignity of her husband's name, reinforced her status as the lawful center of the family. Her authority was neither spontaneous nor flexible. It was written into the expectations of society itself. By contrast, a mistress arrived not through agreements or ceremony, but through quiet shifts in attention. No contracts secured her place. No lineage validated her presence. She existed because desire created a space where legality could not reach. Her influence depended entirely on emotional favor, a type of power that refused to settle into recognizable form. While the wife's position was carved into stone, the mistress's position floated in the air, visible, undeniable, and dangerously fragile. Within this contrast, authority divided itself along two uneven lines. The wife wielded formal power, control over the household, supervision of staff, and participation in decisions that affected the family's social standing. Every gesture she made carried official weight. Yet she operated under a surveillance shaped by expectations of virtue, obedience, and restraint. Any misstep, however small, threatened to stain not only her reputation, but the reputation of an entire lineage. A mistress exercised influence of a different nature. She shaped moods, softened tempers, or altered priorities through proximity rather than decree. Her power hid itself in moments, private conversations, lingering glances, or quiet companionship offered at the right time. This influence lacked permanence and legitimacy, but it could redirect the emotional life of a man whose decisions shaped the lives of many. In a world steeped in ceremony, the mistress represented a kind of informal force that the court pretended to ignore while constantly responding to. For the wife, stability was both a privilege and a trap. She held the lawful claim to place, property, and lineage. Servants addressed her with deference. Visitors respected her position, and society relied on her as the symbol of family continuity. Yet her security was bound tightly to her husband's will. A coldness in his tone, a shift in his interest, or a new distraction at court could isolate her more thoroughly than any explicit punishment. The structure that supported her also confined her, demanding silent endurance in the face of humiliation she could not openly protest. A mistress, meanwhile, moved through a world without certainty. Admiration could cloak her in temporary protection, but admiration could also turn to blame with startling speed. She had no rights to defend herself, no formal standing to shield her from resentment, and no guarantee that the favour sustaining her today would survive the arrival of someone younger, more charming, or more politically useful. Her existence was a gamble, played with stakes she could neither predict nor control. Despite their opposing roles, both women lived under the weight of a system that measured them through the lens of male authority. A wife's dignity depended on maintaining a position she could not reshape. A mistress's survival depended on navigating emotions she did not lead. The court watched them constantly, assigning meaning to every expression and every silence. Both were exposed to judgments, whispered behind doors, and exchanged in glances across crowded rooms. The tension between them was not always personal. Often, it was structural. A wife represented order the court needed. A mistress represented disruption the court expected. One embodied tradition. The other possibility, their lives ran parallel and collided through circumstances far larger than either woman's intentions. Each bore vulnerabilities rooted in the same system. Vulnerabilities sharpened by hierarchy, expectation, and the ever-present threat of being replaced. A household that housed both roles carried an undercurrent of instability. Servants whispered, noble visitors observed, and alliances shifted depending on which woman appeared to hold more influence that week. The wife felt the ground beneath her tremble when her husband withdrew affection. The mistress felt it tighten when the court shifted attention elsewhere. Neither woman stood on firm soil, though one seemed elevated and the other exposed. What drew the starkest line between them was memory. A wife was preserved in records, bound into family histories, and woven into the narrative of lineage. A mistress lived in rumour, faded in silence, and disappeared once her usefulness ended. Her story survived only if scandal clung to it. Otherwise, she vanished without a trace, replaced by another who would navigate the same dangerous cycle. In the end, both women inhabited different versions of the same confinement. One built of law, the other of desire. One was visible in daylight, carrying the burden of public virtue. The other existed in shadow, carrying the burden of being both wanted and expendable. Their contrast revealed not opposition but reflection. Two forms of captivity shaped by the expectations of a world designed to control them. Her lawful status granted structure, but not safety. Emotional favour offered influence, but no shield against loss. Quiet fractures formed where their lives intersected, hinting at conflicts the household could no longer contain. Observation shaped every corner of the Tudor court, tightening around the king's mistress long before she recognised its full weight. Once, attention fell on her. She became a point of silent fascination that drew eyes from every direction. Servants tracked her movements with the cautious precision of those who understood that information was as valuable as labour. Relatives of the noble household assessed her quietly, measuring the potential advantage or threat she represented. Other women, bound by their own positions within the court's hierarchy, monitored her with a mixture of curiosity, resentment, and wary calculation. Her world, once defined by routine, transformed into a stage she had never agreed to step upon. Nothing she did went unnoticed. A glance toward the floor, a brief smile, a moment of hesitation. Each became material for speculation. She felt the scrutiny in subtle shifts. A servant, lingering longer than necessary. A lady in waiting, pausing before responding. A distant cousin studying her as though she were a puzzle to be solved. Even the smallest gesture seemed to echo through the household, interpreted and reinterpreted by those who had nothing to gain from accuracy, but much to gain from gossip. The servants saw most of all. Their presence filled the spaces she once moved through unnoticed. They prepared her chamber, fetched her clothing, passed her in hallways, and heard fragments of conversations intended only for private exchange. Their knowledge rarely travelled directly. Instead, it seeped through the court in bits and pieces, shaped by assumptions and amplified by repetition. They did not need malice to cause harm. Information, once shared, took on a life of its own, carried by whispers that grew stronger with each retelling. Relatives within the household observed her with a different kind of scrutiny. They evaluated her not simply as a woman, but as a disruption to the existing order. Some viewed her as a temporary disturbance, someone who would fade once attention shifted elsewhere. Others perceived her as a threat to alliances, inheritances, or reputations. Their observations came wrapped in polite expressions and measured tones. Yet beneath them lay a quiet hostility she could sense, but could not directly confront. They watched her as people watch a candle left burning too close to a curtain. Something small that might ignite disaster. Women at court scrutinized her with an intimacy sharpened by their own vulnerability. They recognized in her a pattern they had seen before, a young woman elevated suddenly, pulled into dangerous proximity to power, and exposed to pressures she could not escape. Some felt pity, aware of how quickly admiration turned into condemnation. Others felt resentment, perceiving her as someone who benefited from a system that diminished them. Their eyes followed her with a mixture of judgment and apprehension, for her rise suggested the possibility of their own fall. Under such constant watch, her movements grew measured. She chose her words with caution. Aware that tone carried as much weight as content, she learned to keep her hands still, her expression composed, her posture carefully restrained. Any impulsive moment risked becoming a rumor. Any display of emotion risked being interpreted as manipulation or instability. She existed in a space where privacy dissolved, replaced by a version of herself crafted through the interpretations of others. Even her solitude was compromised. Time spent alone in her chamber felt occupied by invisible eyes, as though the walls themselves were primed to carry her secrets outward. She could not trust the quiet, for the court had a way of filling silence with suspicion. A brief absence from a gathering might be judged as arrogance. A moment of illness could be framed as emotional fragility. She discovered that anonymity had been a luxury she never appreciated until it vanished. Her efforts to remain unobtrusive often failed. The more she attempted to blend into the background, the more intently others studied her, trying to discern whether her quiet was humility or strategy. Every action, no matter how small, required calculation. She carried herself with the awareness of someone walking across a floor scattered with glass. Each step deliberate, because each misstep could cut deeply. In time, she came to understand that being observed was not a temporary condition, but the defining feature of her new existence. The court thrived on watching her, judging her, predicting her downfall, or imagining her influence. She had become a focal point in a system that valued scrutiny more than truth. The household adjusted around her not because of who she was, but because of what she represented, an unpredictable shift in the delicate balance of power. She realized that she no longer lived a private life, but a collective imagination crafted by those around her. Their assumptions shaped her reputation. Their interpretations shaped her fate. What she felt mattered far less than what others believed she felt. In a place where surveillance replaced understanding, her humanity became secondary to the role she was forced to embody. Her days unfolded beneath an unbroken web of watchful eyes. Every gesture she made was captured, interpreted, unfolded into narratives beyond her control. A new tension gathered at the edges of her world, preparing to twist her visibility into a sharper form of danger. Favour within the Tudor world carried a brightness that blinded more than it illuminated. A woman who rose through the king's attention often found herself standing in a glow she had never sought. A glow that revealed not privilege but exposure. The court admired her only briefly. Admiration quickly curdled into resentment once people realized how her presence disrupted their expectations. What began as a moment of elevation became the source of subtle hostility spreading through the household in quiet, measured waves. Envy took root first. It rarely announced itself through open conflict. Instead, it appeared in sidelong glances, in the tightening of jaws, in the faint hesitation before a greeting. Women who had secured their positions through lineage or marriage began to treat her as an unwelcome variable in a carefully controlled environment. They recognized how fragile their own influence was, and her arrival reminded them that the court could shift with alarming speed. Their resentment did not need to be spoken for her to feel its pressure. Jealousy followed, sharp and instinctive. It required no justification. It did not matter whether she sought attention or recoiled from it. The mere fact that attention had been given to her was enough to provoke suspicion. Married women feared for their husbands' loyalty, for reputation was always precarious in a world where rumour held more power than fact. Young ladies feared the loss of opportunities they had quietly hoped for. Every woman who saw her rise felt a ripple of anxiety, wondering if the court would next turn its gaze toward their own vulnerabilities. She bore this jealousy without defense. Any attempt to appear humble could be interpreted as calculated modesty. Any sign of confidence could be twisted into arrogance. The court excelled at transforming innocence into intent. People watched her not to understand her, but to assign her a purpose that suited their fears. Her actions became mirrors, reflecting the insecurities of others. And she was blamed for meanings she had never created. In such an atmosphere, evidence became unnecessary. Accusations grew from impressions rather than truth. A whisper about her presence near a certain chamber could evolve into a narrative of manipulation. A fleeting smile could be retold as seduction. A moment of fatigue might be framed as emotional instability. The court did not need proof. It needed only interest. Once people decided she was a threat, they molded every detail to support that conclusion. What made her situation more precarious was the imbalance of power between perception and reality. Her actual influence, small, inconsistent, and often misunderstood, mattered far less than the version of influence others imagined she held. In a place dependent on hierarchy, those just beneath the king felt threatened by anyone who altered the emotional landscape around him. They feared losing their access, their intimacy, or their importance. She became a symbol of disruption, and symbols were easy to destroy. Even those who envied her did not wish to become her. They recognized the danger beneath the surface of her favor. To be admired by the king was to stand close to a flame that burned unpredictably. It meant being watched constantly, judged harshly, and held responsible for shifts in mood she could not control. People resented her advantages, yet they also predicted her downfall. Their resentment carried an undertone of satisfaction, as though they were already preparing to witness her collapse. Into this volatile environment stepped the most dangerous force of all, the whisper. It did not need volume. It did not need clarity. It required only timing. A single, well-placed suggestion, spoken to the right listener, could alter the entire course of her life. Courtiers understood how to craft such whispers, soft enough to seem casual, vague enough to avoid blame, sharp enough to shape perception. Once carried from one ear to another, the whisper gained momentum, growing heavier with each retelling until it resembled truth. She might sense its presence before she heard it. A servant's sudden stiffness, a conversation that quieted at her approach, a smile that faltered too quickly. Small signs that the whisper had begun to circulate. She did not know its content, but she understood its purpose. The court needed no reason to question her. It needed only the suggestion that a reason might exist. Her favour, once a fragile shield, now became the justification for tearing her apart. As attention tightened around her, she realized that rising through affection meant rising into danger. Every kindness the king offered drew sharper eyes toward her. Every gesture of interest deepened the court's fixation. Favor did not protect her from harm. It directed harm toward her with greater precision. The more she was elevated, the more she became a target for forces she could neither name nor confront. Her newfound visibility stirred rivalries she never intended to provoke. Each lingering glance from the king deepened the scrutiny surrounding her. Some quiet rumor drifted through the court, carrying the first hint of a threat she would soon be forced to face. Rumors did not need names or origins. They simply needed space to breathe. And the Tudor court provided that without hesitation. In those long corridors where tapestries softened footsteps, but never softened intent, words floated with a strange weightlessness, as though freed from the burden of truth the moment they left someone's lips. Servants carried them between chambers. Attendants traded them while arranging gowns. Courtiers shaped them with slight tilts of the chin. By the time they reached her, they were no longer whispers, but quiet verdicts, already settled in the minds of those who mattered. She learned that nothing in this palace moved faster than suspicion disguised as conversation. Not even desire could outrun it. She noticed it first in the pauses. The way a greeting landed slightly late. The way the two women stopped adjusting their sleeves the moment she passed. The way a man's eyes flicked from her face to someone else's before returning with a too polite smile. These were not accusations. Accusations at least had direction. These were drifting suggestions, shaped to resemble mere observations. Yet cutting her with edges she could not prove existed. She understood quickly that the court preferred implications over clarity. Clarity forced responsibility, and responsibility was dangerous. There were days when she tried to trace a rumor back to its beginning, only to find that every path dissolved into vague shrugs and half-phrases. People are talking. Someone would murmur. They say things. Another would add. No one ever explained who they were. No one ever confessed to being the first spark. The court operated like a single organism, with many mouths but no throat to seize. Many hands but none to hold accountable. Words simply existed. And once they existed, they became real enough to shape her life. She found herself shrinking in small ways without realizing it, lingering less in doorways, speaking only when directly addressed, moving through rooms as though her presence required permission, not because she feared what was being said, but because she feared how silence interpreted her attempts to respond. In this place, silence was not neutral. Silence meant consent, guilt, or calculation. Whichever interpretation harmed her most at the moment, there was no gesture she could make that would not be examined from multiple angles, each one sharpened by someone else's ambition. When she tried to speak plainly about the rumors, her words sounded thin even to her own ears. The court responded with sympathetic nods that never softened into understanding. They looked at her with eyes that said, "If people whisper about you, there must be a reason." The logic was circular and cruel, yet entirely accepted here. She realized that a rumor did not need proof. It needed endurance. The longer it survived, the more believable it became, until its origin no longer mattered at all. She became familiar with the sensation of being watched, not for what she did, but for what people decided she represented. Some evenings, while the palace settled into its dim candlelight, she sensed the whispers tightening around her like threads pulled from every corner of the court. A lady adjusting her rings, a servant passing too quietly, a pair of men speaking near a window, lowering their voices only when she approached. She felt herself becoming a space people pointed to without pointing, a story they discussed without telling, a question no one asked directly because they already enjoyed the answer they had invented. It wasn't the accusations themselves that frightened her. It was the way everyone behaved as though they were merely observing a process they had not participated in, even as their participation sustained it. No one claimed ownership of the words, yet the words ruled her days. No one said her name aloud, yet her name shaped every sideways glance. The court thrived on this absence of accountability. It was easier to let whispers decide a person's fate than to confront what silence allowed to grow. As she moved through those weeks, she came to understand a bleak truth. Once a whisper began, her innocence ceased to matter. The court did not care whether something was true. It cared whether something was useful, and whispers were always useful to someone. Her days became shaped by the weight of rumors she could not confront. Every silence around her sharpened those drifting accusations until they felt almost solid. Some unseen hand was already preparing the next blow. One that would strike at the fragile reputation she had yet to understand was slipping away. Reputation for a mistress inside the Tudor court was less a possession than a phantom, visible to everyone, yet held by no one, least of all by her. She could not touch it, defend it, or define it, and yet it clung to her every movement like a shadow that absorbed more light than it gave. The court watched her not for who she was, but for what they believed she might become. And the difference between those two versions of herself grew wider with each passing day. She had learned by now that she could not step forward to correct a lie or silence a rumor. Public defense was a privilege reserved for those with names carved into lineage, not for someone who existed in the fragile space between desire and dismissal. Even a whisper questioning her virtue, her intentions, or her past could unravel everything she had been carefully constructing. She realized how narrow her footing was whenever conversations shifted as she entered a room. Those small pauses revealed that the court knew how easily she could fall, and some waited for exactly that moment. She had no formal standing, no right to object, no authority to demand truth. Even the king's favour, so intoxicating in its early glow, offered no shield against the stories rising around her. The higher he lifted her, the farther others believed she might fall. And that fall became a spectacle the court quietly prepared for. She walked through corridors, knowing that every pleasant smile might be masking calculation, that every kind word might be softened only by strategy. There were days when she tried to recall how her reputation had first begun to slip. She could not isolate a single moment. It could have been a glance held too long in the great hall, a visit to a chamber at an unfortunate hour, or a small gift misunderstood by watching eyes. In truth, it did not matter. Virtue, once questioned, was rarely restored in this place. The court did not wait for certainty. It built narratives from fragments, weaving her life into a fabric she did not recognize. She had become the subject of a story that grew larger each time it was retold, one that turned her into a figure of suspicion even when she remained silent. One accusation, spoken softly, without insistence, was enough to tilt the floor beneath her. She felt its echo in the way people addressed her, in the sharpness of their politeness, in the thinness of their smiles. They no longer saw a young woman caught in currents beyond her control. They saw opportunity in her vulnerability. Once the idea of impropriety attached itself to her, it became self-proving. If she smiled, she was scheming. If she frowned, she was hiding something. If she stayed quiet, she was guilty. If she denied anything, she was desperate. Every path led to a conclusion that served someone else's purpose. She knew that the most dangerous transformation came not from outright lies, but from the revision of memories. People began to reinterpret her past interactions through the lens of their new suspicions. A greeting became a sign of ambition. A brief conversation became a plot. A moment of kindness became manipulation. They reshaped her history with ease, as though it were soft clay meant for their hands alone. Even events she barely remembered were reconstructed with a certainty that terrified her. She felt her identity bending under the pressure of interpretations she had no power to correct. In quiet moments, she wondered why defending herself felt impossible. The court had mastered the art of making denial look like confirmation. They believed what benefited them, not what she spoke aloud. Her efforts to clarify her actions were met with feigned sympathy. People nodding, as though understanding her perfectly, even while carrying her words somewhere else to twist them into implications that suited new rumors. She learned quickly that silence might be her only defense. But silence also implied acceptance. The court left her no weapon that did not cut her in return. There were nights when she sensed her entire existence tightening around a single truth. Her reputation lived in other people's mouths, not in her own hands. One misplaced suspicion could unmake her. One convenient story could bury her. And once the court decided on a version of her identity, it rarely changed its mind. She walked with the uneasy awareness that her life could shift in an instant. Not because of anything she did, but because someone needed her to serve a narrative. The most unsettling realization came when she understood that her past no longer belonged to her. The court had begun rewriting it with confidence, turning her into someone she had never been. She could feel the old versions of herself. The quieter girl, the obedient servant, the woman who once believed in simple affection, slowly dissolving beneath the weight of the identity imposed upon her. What survived was a figure of intrigue, danger, and ambition, crafted from rumors given more authority than her own voice. Her standing now balanced on stories she never told and choices she never made. Each rumor reshaped her identity more sharply than any truth she tried to protect. What waited beyond this moment carried the power to erase even more of her, long before she understood how little of herself she had left to lose. There came a point when his attention, once warm enough to steady her steps, began to shift in ways she could feel before she could name. The same gaze that had lifted her from obscurity now moved across her with a caution that felt colder than direct rejection. He no longer lingered when she spoke, no longer sought her in crowded chambers, with the quiet intent that once made her believe she held a place no one else could claim. She sensed a distance forming, not abrupt, not announced, but unmistakable. It was the kind of distance a man created when he realized that the woman he had chosen for pleasure now carried consequences he no longer wished to face. His favor had become dangerous, not for him, but for her. The shift began subtly, in the way he listened. Where once he responded with ease, he now paused before offering even simple words, as though he feared how each comment might be interpreted, repeated, or held against him by others who watched their closeness too closely. The court missed nothing. Every movement he made around her was measured by eyes that carried their own ambitions. He felt their scrutiny, and she bore its cost. She noticed how he avoided meeting her alone, how he preferred spaces where others could see them but not question him. It was a performance meant to distance himself without fully withdrawing. She understood the cruelty of it. He protected his standing by letting hers erode. The court, always sensitive to changes in power, adjusted quickly. They read his caution, not as hesitation, but as permission. If he no longer displayed confidence in her, why should they? Once, her quiet presence near him drew murmurs of envy. Now, it drew speculation wrapped in courtesy. A smile offered to her could be taken back without consequence. And those who once sought her favor found no reason to continue the pretense. They shifted their allegiances with the same ease they shifted their expressions. She watched these changes closely, though she pretended not to. To acknowledge them openly would have made her vulnerability visible. And vulnerability in the Tudor court was a wound waiting for a blade. In the privacy of her chambers, she tried to understand what had changed. She had obeyed, listened, and remained discreet. She had stepped carefully through every corridor, ensuring that no gesture drew unnecessary attention. Yet none of that mattered. A mistress existed only as long as she was convenient. and convenience faded the moment she became a risk to a man defending his authority. She saw now that his affection had never been a shield. It had been a temporary curtain behind which she could rest until someone tugged the fabric aside. That moment had arrived, and she stood exposed to the harshness of the court's gaze. He began to blame her without accusation. A sigh held too long. A silence left unresolved. A small frown when she spoke too honestly. These were not punishments, but indicators. Signals that he perceived her as a source of instability rather than comfort. The more accusations the court whispered about her, the more he hesitated to be associated with her. She watched him retreat into the safety of his rank, into the identity that had always mattered more than anything he felt. She understood then that a mistress who appeared to stir trouble, even unintentionally, became a threat to the fragile balance he maintained between desire and reputation. A threat was easier to discard than defend. Her presence began to carry a weight she could not set down. People observed her with a sharpened curiosity, as if waiting for her to misstep so they could say they had seen it coming. She had become the center of a story she did not write, a figure whose every movement seemed to confirm the court's suspicions. It no longer mattered whether she acted with caution or dignity. Her downfall was already imagined by those who stood to gain from it. The king's caution only fueled their confidence. If he doubted her, why shouldn't they? There were evenings when she could feel the court drawing away from her, like a tide retreating from the shore, exposing the vulnerable ground beneath. She walked through the palace with a quiet awareness that she was being measured, evaluated, and quietly dismissed. Even gestures meant to comfort her sounded hollow, as though those offering them were rehearsing their words for the moment they would need to deny ever being close to her. She felt surrounded by people preparing to forget her, even before she disappeared. The harshest truth settled slowly. She had not changed. But his perception of her had, in a court ruled by power, a mistress who attracted too much attention, whether admiration or suspicion, became a liability. Her presence, once flattering to him, now risked drawing questions he did not want to answer. And so he allowed the court's coldness to guide his own. She watched him defend his position with the ease of a man accustomed to survival, even if it meant sacrificing the woman he once pursued so intently. She understood then that the danger had never been in the affection itself. The danger lay in believing that affection could protect her from the system that had always seen her as expendable. His caution was not cruelty, it was instinct. And instinct, in the Tudor court, rarely spared anyone. Her place beside him shifted into something fragile enough to fracture at a breath. Every sign of his hesitation deepened the court's certainty that her fall would serve its purposes well. The silence closing in around her carried an impending turn, one that would measure how swiftly the court intended to push her aside. She began to sense the shift long before anyone spoke it aloud, though the signs revealed themselves with a clarity that tightened her breath. No longer did her presence draw the quiet satisfaction that once flickered in his eyes. Instead, it summoned a restrained calculation, as though he were weighing the cost of acknowledging her at all. What had once been a private indulgence, something sought in moments of escape from the court's relentless demands, was now viewed through a colder lens. She was no longer simply a mistress chosen by desire. She was becoming a reminder of choices he wished he had never made. The intimacy that once shielded her now exposed her to a danger that grew sharper each day. Conversations around her took on a brittle tone. Courtiers who once flirted with friendliness now measured their smiles with caution, as if aligning themselves too closely with her could taint their own standing. A glance held too long was no longer envy. It was a warning. A polite bow from a lady who once whispered confidences now carried the distance of someone preparing to rewrite the nature of their acquaintance. The court, quick to sense vulnerability, adapted with the same ease it always had. They adjusted their behavior not because of anything she did, but because of what he had stopped doing, offering public signs of favor. His hesitation rippled outward, and she bore every vibration of its spreading doubt. In private, he became restless. His hands, once steady on her waist, now hovered briefly before pulling away, as though physical closeness itself had become incriminating. He spoke less, not because he lacked affection, but because affection had turned into risk. She saw him glance toward the door more often, listening for footsteps that might misinterpret his presence in her chamber. She recognized these changes immediately, but she never confronted him. In the Tudor court, confrontation was a luxury someone like her could not afford. Instead, she watched him retreat and forced her voice to remain calm, steady, agreeable, anything to soften the fear she sensed growing behind his silence. Rumors adapted too. Where once people whispered about her beauty or the king's desire, they now spoke of her influence, her ambition, her supposed attempts to secure a place she had never sought. These stories found fertile ground because the court loved nothing more than a narrative that promised downfall. The whispers painted her as a liability, a woman whose presence complicated alliances, whose existence disrupted expectations, whose rise threatened the delicate hierarchy that balanced noble families against one another. She had become too visible, too discussed, too central to a story the court preferred to contain. She walked through the halls knowing that some now considered her not only an inconvenience but a mistake, one that required correction. The shift was not loud, but it was unmistakable. Men avoided being seen speaking to her. Women stopped offering invitations, even servants, usually indifferent to political tides, watched her with the guarded expressions of people anticipating an order that had not yet been given. Every action around her suggested a future already being planned in rooms she would never enter. In rare moments, when he still visited her, she saw the conflict on his face. He was not unkind. He was afraid. Not of her, but of what she represented. His affection had become evidence. Evidence that he had allowed desire to cloud judgment. That he had elevated a woman who should have remained comfortably invisible. To preserve his authority, he needed distance. To preserve his reputation, he needed to restore control. And to restore control, he needed her to shrink, to disappear, to stop existing as a subject of conversation. She understood this even before he did. The court did not allow a mistress to remain simply a private pleasure once her presence disrupted political balance. The further she rose, the more dangerous she became. To him, to herself, and to the structure that had tolerated her only as long as she remained silent and ornamental. Now, the court wanted a correction, and corrections in this world were rarely gentle. One evening, as she crossed a narrow passage lit with dim sconces, she heard two ladies speaking behind a tapestry. Their voices were low, but their meaning reached her with the clarity of a blade sliding cleanly through fabric. They did not speak of her as someone who had once been favoured. They spoke of her as a problem, and problems in the Tudor court were solved quietly. She walked away with steady steps, though inside she felt something closing around her. A slow constriction, like the drawing of a noose by hands that did not need to rush. She had been chosen in a moment of impulse, lifted by desire that cared little for consequence. Now she was being measured, weighed, and prepared for removal through the same whispers that once celebrated her rise. Her shift from cherished secret to looming threat unfolded without a single spoken accusation. Every altered glance confirmed that the court had already begun rewriting her place among them. A quiet momentum was gathering behind her steps, preparing to decide how far she would fall once the court no longer needed her presence. Removal never arrived with ceremony. It arrived with arrangements spoken in gentle tones, delivered by people who pretended to be offering kindness. She first sensed it in the subtle reassignment of her chambers, moved a little farther from the king's path, a little closer to the quiet wings, where forgotten figures lived out the ends of their usefulness. No one called it exile. They called it necessity, decorum, proper order, words meant to soothe, yet each one stripped another layer from her place in the court. She walked through familiar rooms, noticing how conversations dimmed, how doors that once opened eagerly now closed a moment too soon. She was not dismissed, but repositioned, which in the Tudor court meant something far worse. Repositioning was the first step toward disappearance. The king no longer sought her directly. Instead, messages arrived through attendants who avoided meeting her eyes. Instructions became vaguer, visits rarer, explanations non-existent. It was clear that decisions involving her future were being made elsewhere, in rooms where she was discussed but never invited. Those decisions were structured with the careful politeness of men who wished to believe they were acting with responsibility rather than betrayal. They did not intend cruelty, they intended convenience. Yet convenience in this world was often indistinguishable from abandonment. Whispers reached her before any official order did. She heard mention of a distant household in need of refined company, of a northern estate requiring a lady to oversee its winter preparations. These possibilities drifted through the court with the softness of suggestions. But she recognized them as the early drafts of her removal. Then came talk of an uncle seeking to secure a marriage for her, an uncle she had not heard from in years, now suddenly invested in her well-being. Marriage, in this context, did not represent opportunity. It represented erasure. A rapid union to a man she barely knew would resolve the problem she had become for the court. It would silence her, to relocate her, and classify her future as respectable, controllable, and distant. For others like her, the destination was not always marriage. Some were sent to small religious houses, places of quiet prayer and quiet confinement. A mistress who had become inconvenient could easily be persuaded to embrace piety, often through pressures disguised as spiritual concern. A life behind convent walls was framed as refuge, protection, and redemption. But everyone understood the truth. It was a means to remove a woman whose presence could no longer be permitted in the orbit of power. Once inside, she would vanish from conversation, swallowed by the rhythm of bells and silence. She walked through the gardens one morning, feeling the space contract around her. Conversations grew shorter. Invitations stopped arriving. Servantes, who once confided small gossip to her, now carried news of plans she had never heard discussed. Something was being prepared. Her absence was being organized before she had even been told she would be absent. She understood that in this court, explanations were unnecessary. The decision to move her, whether to a distant estate, a forced marriage, or a cold stone convent, did not require justification. It required only the agreement of those who wished to forget she had once stood near the king. What frightened her most was not the prospect of leaving, but the speed with which others adjusted to her fading presence. People who once depended on her influence now spoke of her in the past tense, as though she had already gone. Ladies who once sought her favor shifted their attention to new faces rising in the court. Even the king, when she saw him from across the hall, he looked at her with the softened expression one reserves for something already concluded. There was no anger in his eyes, nor regret. Only the quiet relief of a man who believed he had untangled himself from a complication. Her fate would not be announced. It would simply occur. One morning, she would wake to find that her belongings had been packed. An escort would wait at the door. Instructions would be written on parchment sealed by hands that wished to avoid speaking to her directly. She would step into a carriage or onto a horse, escorted by guards who did not know her, travelling toward a place chosen by people who would never see the life she lost. No farewell, no explanation, no acknowledgement of what her presence had once meant. She would disappear from the court exactly as many before her had. Quietly, efficiently, without leaving enough of a mark for anyone to question the necessity of her removal. It was the court's way. A mistress rose unnoticed and vanished the same way. Her existence folded neatly into the spaces between official records. No justification was required. Her story belonged to no one. Her removal took shape in small adjustments that softened her existence long before she was gone. Every polite gesture around her revealed how thoroughly the court had accepted her disappearance as inevitable. Some distant choice was already tightening around her path, preparing to lift her away from the center and dissolve whatever remained of her place in that world. There was no ceremony for her departure, no gathering of courtiers to mark the moment her presence slipped from the palace walls. A mistress did not receive condolences, commemorations, or quiet acknowledgements. She simply ceased to be spoken of. The silence was not accidental. It was the court's preferred method of cleansing itself of inconvenient attachments. Those who had once watched her closely now looked past her absence with the ease of people turning a page they had never intended to keep. She felt, even before she left, the shape of her erasure forming around her. A slow fading that erased warmth, memory, and meaning. Her fall did not inspire sympathy. The court saved its sorrow for noble tragedies, not for a woman whose place had been deemed temporary from the moment she was noticed. When she vanished from the king's circle, no one murmured prayers for her well-being. They simply adjusted to new arrangements, new alliances, new faces rising in her place. Even those who had relied on her influence quickly learned to avoid mentioning her name. It was safer to let her become a ghost than to be caught remembering her. Regret was a luxury, and no one in the Tudor court risked sentiment when ambition offered more reliable protection. She had no control over how her story was retold. Once she lost her proximity to the king, she also lost the power to shape how she was remembered. People reconstructed her life with the confidence of witnesses, even when they had never known her. A gesture became a flaw. A moment of hesitation became a scheme. A careless rumor hardened into fact simply because she no longer held a place from which to dispute it. The court excelled at rewriting the past. It carved narratives quickly, smoothing away any nuance that might complicate the version of her fate they preferred to believe. No record existed to defend her. Official accounts rarely mentioned the women who drifted into and out of royal favor, and when they did, the tone was never generous. Chroniclers wrote of mistresses only when their presence fueled scandal or threatened political order. Her kindnesses were forgotten, her fears ignored, her vulnerabilities dismissed as weakness. What remained in the written traces of her life were distortions, exaggerations, and fragments chosen for their ability to entertain, not illuminate. She had lived a life filled with small moments, private struggles, quiet hopes. But history did not care for softness. It cared only for spectacle, and she provided one by falling. She would not become a cautionary tale spoken with compassion. She would become an example wielded to restore propriety. Mothers whispered their story to daughters to warn them against ambition. Men used her name to justify stricter boundaries. Courtiers referenced her downfall to signal their loyalty to order. In each retelling, she became less human and more symbol, stripped of detail and remade into something the court could use long after she was gone. A mistress's legacy belonged to others, and they shaped it according to their needs, not her truth. There were moments, even before her removal was complete, when she sensed how thoroughly she had already been displaced from memory. Passing through the great hall, she overheard two courtiers discussing her rise as though it had happened to someone else entirely, describing motives she never possessed, alliances she never formed, intentions she never imagined. Her protests would have sounded laughable. The court did not care if she contradicted their stories. Contradiction only proved how necessary it was to silence her. She understood that by losing relevance, she had also lost credibility. The harshest truth came when she realized that her suffering would never be acknowledged. Whatever fear she endured, whatever loneliness shadowed her final days in the court, would remain private. Her departure was designed to be forgettable, her struggles unrecorded, her pain unremarked. The world she had lived in allowed no room for empathy toward a woman who had once benefited from a king's affection. Empathy required recognizing her humanity, and the court had no interest in granting her that dignity. A mistress was useful, then disposable, then forgotten. Her existence would be folded into the margins of history, spoken of in whispers, footnotes, and half-remembered anecdotes. No chronicle would describe the girl she once was. No document would reflect her hopes or the quiet resilience with which she endured her unraveling. Instead, her name, if it appeared at all, would be tied to scandal, caution, or moral judgment. That was the fate allotted to women like her, to be remembered not for who they were, but for what the world believed they represented. Her disappearance left no visible wound on the court, only a faint outline where her presence had once unsettled the air. Every retelling of her life drifted further from truth, settling instead into the version most useful to those who survived her. Something still unspoken waited beyond her erasure, shaping the path for the women who would rise after her and fall just as quietly. Silence did not descend all at once. It settled slowly, as though the walls themselves were training her to speak less with each passing day. After she fell from favor, words became a luxury she could no longer afford. Anything she said might be repeated, reshaped, or used to reinforce the narrative already tightening around her. She learned quickly that the court did not expect her to defend herself. It expected her to retreat, to remain quiet, to let the story of her downfall proceed without interruption. A mistress who tried to explain her actions was not seen as brave. She was seen as dangerous. A woman who refused to accept her assigned place in the aftermath of her own erasure. There was no space left for her voice. No audience is willing to listen. The women who once visited her chamber drifted away under the pretense of busier schedules. Men who once admired her now nodded only from a distance. Even servants approached her with the careful composure of people instructed not to linger. She felt conversations closing like doors before she even entered the room. Silence became both expectation and warning. Speak, and you will invite suspicion. Remain quiet, and you might still be allowed to leave with dignity. She understood the threat immediately. To resist her new invisibility was to risk something far worse than exile. The court punished disobedience in ways that never needed to be recorded. A complaint could become treason. A denial could be twisted into proof of guilt. A single attempt to reclaim her voice could provoke consequences she could neither predict nor withstand. She had seen it before. How a woman who tried to defend herself was accused of manipulation, deceit, or hysteria. The more she spoke, the deeper she sank. Silence, though suffocating, was the only protection left to her. But silence carried its own cruelty. Each day, she felt pieces of herself slipping away, as though her identity were dissolving into the spaces she could no longer fill with words. Her memories felt distant, muted by the pressure to disappear gracefully. She had once held a place in the king's gaze, once walked hallways where people lowered their voices out of respect or envy. Now those same hallways echoed with the absence of her name. Not speaking became a form of disappearance, a steady erasure carried out by her own restraint. She wondered, at times, whether anyone else realized how much she lost by remaining quiet. Yet she knew the truth. Most people preferred her silence. It made everything easier for them. Easier to forget her. Easier to justify her removal. Easier to continue living in a world where women like her could vanish without consequence. Silence was not merely expected. It was required to maintain the illusion of order that the court valued so deeply. Her voice had become a threat to that order, even if all she wanted was to be remembered accurately. There were nights when she thought about speaking out. Just once. Just enough to reclaim some small part of her story. But she knew the cost. To challenge the version of events crafted by those in power was to destroy any hope she had of survival. The Tudor court was ruthless not because it punished loudly, but because it punished quietly. People disappeared without anyone admitting their role in the disappearance. A mistress who refused silence could easily become another cautionary tale, remembered briefly and inaccurately before being replaced by new scandals. In the stillness of her dimly lit chamber, she learned the discipline of fading. She avoided gatherings. She answered only when addressed. She limited her movements to spaces where few people ventured. With each concession, she felt herself shrinking into someone smaller, safer, easier to forget. It was not cowardice. It was survival. To remain visible was to invite harm. To vanish was to endure. The court rewarded women who accepted their invisibility. It punished those who resisted. And she, with no allies and no authority, had no choice but to conform. What she feared most was how natural the silence began to feel. Days passed without her speaking more than a handful of words. Weeks slipped by in which no one asked her opinion or sought her perspective. The quieter she became, the more the world around her seemed to confirm that she no longer mattered. It was a peculiar kind of death, not of the body, but of relevance, influence, and narrative. She lived, but only in the spaces others overlooked. In time, she understood the truth that defined the fate of every discarded mistress. Survival did not depend on strength or dignity, but on the ability to vanish without leaving ripples. To remain alive, she had to make herself small enough to escape notice, silent enough to erase suspicion, and compliant enough to avoid becoming a problem worth solving. Disappearance was not her downfall. It was her only path forward. Her world narrowed into a life measured by the words she no longer dared to speak. Each quiet day deepened the court's certainty that she had accepted her place in their version of her story. Somewhere beyond that silence, her future waited to be shaped by those who preferred her forgotten. There were no proclamations, no formal accusations, no parchment stamped with an official seal to explain what was happening to her. Instead, the process unfolded with the quiet inevitability of something everyone already understood, but no one bothered to name. Destruction in the Tudor court did not require a judge, it required distance. A single step back from those who once greeted her warmly. A shift in a conversation she used to be welcome in. A silence that filled the room when she entered. Each sign small on its own. Yet together they formed the outline of a judgment passed without a single spoken word. She felt it long before she could trace its beginning. As though the world around her had agreed upon a conclusion she was not allowed to contest. People did not accuse her. They simply stopped including her. They did not confront her. They merely behaved as if her presence complicated the air. A woman might smile at her in the corridor. Yet, avoid brushing shoulders with her a moment later. A man might bow, but with a stiffness that revealed he wished to be elsewhere. The king himself no longer looked her way unless necessary. And when he did, his eyes held the muted expression of someone acknowledging a memory rather than a person. She was not condemned. She was erased by courtesy. What unsettled her most was the effortlessness of it. The court did not need to punish her directly. It lets implication do the work. Once enough people turned away, the path beneath her feet narrowed until she had nowhere left to stand. She moved through rooms that once felt familiar and now felt hostile in their indifference. Indifference, she learned, could wound more deeply than cruelty. Cruelty at least acknowledged her existence. Indifference pretended she had never mattered. This was how the Tudor court protected itself. Problems were not dealt with aloud. They were starved of attention, denied the space to continue, dissolved through collective silence. A mistress who became inconvenient was not dragged into a hearing or forced to defend herself. She was left alone long enough for her influence to collapse under its own weight. People drifted away as though guided by instinct. Even those who once relied on her whispered favors now pretended they had never needed her company. She tried, at first, to maintain her composure. She held her posture steady, answered greetings with the same soft voice she had always used, and refused to let her hands tremble when she poured wine or adjusted her gown. But each act of poise deepened the invisible wall around her, for the court had already decided her fate. In a world where reputations could shift in a breath, she understood that stability came only to those with power strong enough to resist erosion. She possessed no such power. Her existence had always been attached to someone else's choice. At night, she replayed the day in her mind, searching for a moment where she might have reclaimed control. Yet nothing had been offered to her. No question to answer. No accusation to refute. No warning she could have acted upon. The destruction of her standing was not a single event but a series of absences. So subtle, they did not feel like blows, until the weight of them threatened to crush her. She lived inside an unravelling that allowed no opportunity for defence. She sometimes wondered who had initiated it, whether it was a rival, a jealous noblewoman, a wary adviser, or the king himself. But the truth slowly revealed itself. It did not matter. Once the court reached its conclusion, the identity of the first whisper became irrelevant. Collective retreat replaced individual blame. The very people who contributed to her downfall could now claim innocence by hiding behind the crowd. This was the essence of the court's cruelty. By acting together in silence, they evaded responsibility for the damage they caused. Her fate continued tightening around her with each passing day. Her invitations disappeared. Her duties shrank. Her presence in any gathering seemed to irritate those who noticed she still existed. She realized then that her life was no longer being shaped by decisions she could see. It was being shaped in shadowed corners, by murmured agreements among people who had already decided that her place should be elsewhere. She was not being punished. She was being removed. One evening, as she walked back to her chambers through a dim corridor, she understood fully what had been done to her. No crime had been named. No evidence had been presented. Yet her life had been dismantled with a precision more absolute than any formal sentence. She did not need a trial to be destroyed. She needed only to be forgotten by enough people who found it convenient not to remember her. Her fall unfolded without verdict or accusation, yet carried the weight of a sentence no court could match. Every step she took revealed how thoroughly the world around her had withdrawn, leaving her to navigate an emptiness shaped by others. Some deeper consequence waited beyond the darkness of this silent judgment, preparing to decide where she would be sent once the court was finished unmaking her. Her disgrace did not end with her own disappearance from the court's attention. It stretched outward, reaching those who shared her name. Her blood, or merely the misfortune of being tied to her by circumstance. Reputation in the Tudor world moved like cold water through stone. Slow, steady, and impossible to reverse once it seeped in. Her family learned this before anyone told them what had happened. Letters arrived less frequently. Neighbours turned conversations toward safer topics. Promised introductions were quietly withdrawn. A single look from the king had lifted her above the stations of her birth. But the loss of that same look now dragged her entire family downward, with a force none of them had been prepared to resist. For her parents, the shame took shape in the tension of unasked questions. People spoke to them gently, but with a reserve that stung. They were treated not as victims, but as contributors to a scandal they could not even name aloud. They had once been proud of her presence in the royal household, telling distant relatives of her fortune, her proximity to power, her refinement. Now, those same relatives began to keep their distance. No family wished to be linked by marriage to those whose daughter had risen too high and fallen too publicly. Even though her departure from favour had been quiet, the absence itself spoke volumes. In the Tudor court, silence always carried an explanation. Her siblings felt the consequences most sharply. Suitors who once expressed interest now turned their eyes elsewhere, claiming newly discovered obligations or shifting alliances. Young men who had flirted with the idea of marrying into a family connected however faintly, to the king, now reconsidered. A mistress removed from favour carried with her a stain that no amount of retelling could erase. If she could fall, then her family must have been flawed from the beginning. If she had angered someone powerful, then her kin must be avoided. These assumptions hardened into obstacles her brothers and sisters could not see, but felt with every social door that quietly failed to open. Her name, once spoken with admiration or curiosity, became something people referenced only with lowered voices. The shame was not located in her actions, but in the perception of them. No one asked what she had endured, they asked what she had done. Her family bore the weight of that question again and again, never allowed to answer it, never able to escape it. They lived beneath the shadow of implications they could not disprove, each rumour stretching to envelop them as naturally as it had consumed her. Even distant cousins felt the echo. The court's memory was long when it came to missteps, but short when it came to fairness. Families were grouped, judged, and reorganized in the minds of others with astonishing ease. A single daughter's fall became a mark on every related branch. Women from her lineage found their marriage prospects collapsing. Men discovered political ambitions, quietly redirected toward others with cleaner reputations. No one said this was punishment, but everyone understood that repercussions rarely announced themselves. Her father once believed that success or failure belonged to the individual, yet he now saw how deeply the court's perception of one could define the fate of many. He walked through markets and gatherings, feeling eyes rest on him, a moment too long, as though measuring whether he, too, shared responsibility for what had happened. His silence became a shield, though it did little to soften the humiliation that settled into the rhythm of daily life. Her mother suffered differently. She felt the loss not only as a public wound, but as a private one. Every discarded garment, every folded letter, every memory of her daughter's rise now cut deeper than any rumour could. She understood that her child had never intended to bring harm to anyone. Yet the world insisted on reading her ambition, or even her obedience, as fault. The mother's grief, quiet and unacknowledged, became another layer in the punishment meted out upon the family. What haunted them most was the realization that they were paying a price for an event they had never witnessed. A glance in a royal hall, a decision made by a king, a rumour whispered by rivals. None of it belonged to them, yet all consequences did. Their fate had been altered by forces beyond their reach, all because their daughter had once stood in the wrong light at the wrong moment. In the end, her family learned the harsh rule that governed the court more firmly than any law. When a woman rises without protection and falls without defence, she does not fall alone. Those who love her fall with her, whether or not they ever stepped inside the palace where her story began. Her disgrace echoed far beyond the chambers, where her silence settled. Each relative felt the sting of a judgment they had no hand in shaping, yet were forced to bear. Some quiet reckoning lingered ahead, preparing to pull them further into consequences none of them could evade. She had once believed, in some small and fragile way, that her presence in the royal household meant she mattered, not as a symbol, but as a person. Yet the longer she lived within the court's shifting corridors, the clearer it became that her worth had never belonged to her at all. She was useful when she comforted a powerful man, when she absorbed his frustrations, when she softened the burdens he refused to show in counsel. Her laughter eased him, her silence protected him, her body reassured him that he remained desired, admired, unchallenged. But these comforts, though wrapped in the illusion of intimacy, were not signs of affection. They were services rendered by someone who existed on the outer rim of authority, valued only so long as she met the unspoken needs of those who controlled her fate. He did not see her as a threat at first. She was a diversion, a warm presence in a cold world, a reminder that even kings were still men. But in the court's eyes, desire was political. A mistress was not merely a private indulgence. She was a potential influence, a possible weakness. To a piece on a board, where men and women pushed each other toward outcomes, no one dared voice aloud. When her proximity to him began to complicate alliances, she became something else entirely, a risk. And risks, in the Tudor court, were not tolerated. They were managed. She saw how easily her identity shifted depending on the needs of the moment. When he wished to escape responsibility, she became the soothing figure who absorbed guilt. When rival noble families sought leverage, she became a target whose removal would secure peace. When the court felt restless, she became a subject for gossip, someone whose choices, imagined or real, could fill evenings with speculation. She had no control over these transformations. Her feelings, her fears, her private thoughts held no relevance. The court dealt in roles, not humanity, and her role was assigned without her consent. The cruelty lay in the simplicity of it. To the men who held power, she was a function, not a person. They spoke of her future with the same detachment they might use when discussing a treaty or a shipment of grain. If keeping her served their aims, she remained. If removing her restored balance, she disappeared. Her desires did not enter the conversation. Her pain did not alter the outcome. She was a living tool, shaped by the will of those who never once asked what she wished for herself. Other women in the court understood this better than she did. They watched her with a mix of pity and calculation, knowing that her presence affected their fortunes even when she never spoke a word. Some saw her as a rival. Others saw her as a reminder of how quickly a woman could be stripped of agency. Those who envied her position forgot how vulnerable she was within it. Those who feared her influence failed to see how little control she possessed. And those who despised her did so because it was easier to blame her than to acknowledge the structure that used them all. She noticed how people discussed her only in terms of impact. They spoke about what she represented rather than who she was. They whispered about the king's judgment, the nobles' alliances, the queen's dignity, and the kingdom's stability. Her name appeared only as an accessory to larger concerns. She was never the subject, always the consequence. Even those who spoke kindly about her did so with the distant voice of people acknowledging a detail, not a life. In rare moments, she allowed herself to imagine a world where she could choose her path, where she could speak openly, move freely, step away without fear of the repercussions her absence might provoke. But that world existed only in the quiet corners of her mind. Here, in the palace, built on ambition and shadows, she was confined to a role that had been prepared long before she arrived. The court did not destroy her deliberately. It simply refused to recognize her beyond the narrow function she served. And when her usefulness ended, the process of removal was so smooth, so practiced, that she almost admired its efficiency. No accusations, no dramatic scenes, only a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a sense that the air had cooled around her, that the ground beneath her no longer held her weight. People stepped aside, doors closed softly, and the life she had been forced into dissolved without ceremony. She was not punished, she was replaced. In the end, she realized the truth that had been waiting for her from the beginning. Within this system, she had never been allowed to be human. She had been reduced to an instrument, shaped by needs she did not share, judged by standards she could not meet, discarded by decisions she never witnessed being made. Her existence in the court had been defined not by who she was, but by how others chose to use her. Every power shift carved away another part of her until only the role remained. Not the woman. What waited beyond her fading importance was already moving into place, ready to reveal how effortlessly power could rewrite a life once it no longer served its purpose. Affection had once seemed like a fragile but recognizable force, something she could feel in his softened voice, in the way he reached for her when the court's demands pressed too heavily upon him. Yet as the world around her shifted, she began to understand that affection in the Tudor court held no weight when measured against the machinery of power. What she had interpreted as sincerity was, in truth, merely comfort. And comfort, she realized, was something a man could abandon the moment it threatened his standing. His tenderness had never been strong enough to shield her, because tenderness had no authority here. It melted beneath the heat of scrutiny, leaving her exposed to consequences she had never caused but could not escape. When people spoke of him, they described power as though it were his native language. They admired his decisiveness, his composure, his ability to bend rooms around his presence. They rarely mentioned the softer parts of him, the ones he shared only in private, the ones she once believed were hers alone to protect. But in the court, a man's feelings held no value if they conflicted with his political needs. He could care for her quietly while allowing the world to dismantle her publicly. She learned this truth slowly, in the space between his lingering glances and his public silence. The man she knew in private was not the same figure the court demanded him to be, and the version he became in those crowded halls was the only one that mattered. Affection asked him to stay near her. Power instructed him to step away. Power won. She found herself trapped between those two forces, one too weak to save her, the other too vast to resist. When he withdrew, it was not out of malice. It was instinct, self-preservation, the reflex of a man who understood that authority required sacrifice. She was simply the easiest sacrifice to make. No law forbade him from protecting her. No rule prevented him from speaking on her behalf. Yet he remained silent, because silence kept him safe. While speaking for her would have exposed him to the court's suspicion, she watched how quickly affection shrank when confronted by the cold expectations of governance. Inquieter moments. She remembered how he once touched her hand as though she anchored him. But even then, she had sensed something restless beneath the gesture. A flicker of uncertainty. A reminder that his life belonged to a world shaped by negotiation and survival. His heart might have reached for her, but his throne never did. Every decision he made served a purpose larger than the two of them. She was a comfort, not a priority, a moment of warmth, not a factor in policy. When the court demanded distance, he obeyed. When the council frowned upon scandal, he adjusted. When whispers grew, his affection retreated into the shadows, where it had no power to protect her. She realized, with growing clarity, that affection in the Tudor world was private, fragile, and easily denied. Power, on the other hand, was loud, public, and absolute. Power shaped alliances, ended disputes, forged marriages, and destroyed reputations. Affection whispered, power commanded, and a mistress, caught between both, was crushed by the gap separating them. If he had loved her, truly and fiercely, it would not have mattered. Love could not overturn alliances or silence nobles or cleanse a scandal. Even queens discovered that affection could not protect them. What chance did a mistress have? She saw how others looked at her, their eyes filled with quiet recognition. Many women in the court understood too well what it meant to be cherished in private and abandoned in public. They knew the boundaries of their influence, the limits placed on their voices, the ease with which men dismissed emotion when it inconvenienced authority. They watched her, not with judgment, but with a weary understanding that felt like a warning. Affection may lift you for a moment, but only power decides whether you survive the fall. Standing between these two forces left her unsteady, unsure of which direction held more danger. If she sought comfort from him, she risked exposing the fragility of their connection. If she kept her distance, she risked dissolving entirely in the court's shifting memory. She lived in a narrow space between desire and dismissal. A place where her existence depended on forces she could neither influence nor predict. With time, she understood something painful but undeniable. Power did not require loyalty. Not from her and not toward her. It rewarded usefulness, not devotion. It protected stability, not emotion. And once she ceased to serve a purpose in the delicate balance of the court, no amount of affection, hers or his, could shield her from the consequences. Her heart had never been the battlefield she needed to fear. The throne was. Every tender moment she once trusted dissolved beneath the weight of alliances she could not see. A deeper shift was beginning to close around her, signaling that love would never endure. The judgment power had already set in motion. Truth in the Tudor court was a fragile thing. Too slow, too heavy, too dependent on evidence no one bothered to seek. But whispers required nothing. They asked for no witnesses, no parchment, no seal. They spread with the ease of breath, drifting from chamber to chamber, reshaping themselves as they moved. She learned this most quietly, not through accusation, but through the sudden shift in how people regarded her. Truth might have offered her a chance at defense. However small, whispers denied her even that. They moved faster than she could speak, and by the time she understood the narrative forming around her, it had already hardened into something that felt indistinguishable from fact. She noticed their power long before she recognized their origin. A servant's bowed head lingered too long. A lady's greeting stiffened at the edges. Two courtiers lowered their voices as she passed, not because they feared she would hear them, but because they hoped she might catch just enough to feel the sting. The content of the whisper did not matter. Its existence was the weapon. Once her name became attached to a rumor, it carried its own momentum, fueled by the satisfaction people found in believing the worst of someone who had once stood close to power. Truth demanded effort. Rumor demanded nothing. The king's silence made everything worse. His refusal to address the stories, whether out of caution, exhaustion, or strategic restraint, allowed others to interpret the silence however they wished. A whispered claim became credible simply because he did not refute it. If he would not speak for her, then surely she must have done something worth hiding. This was how the court reasoned. Absence of denial was confirmation. The truth itself had no place in their thinking. The game depended on imagination, not accuracy. She tried to hold herself still, hoping composure might counter the tide. But composure only made her seem calculated. If she showed fear, she looked guilty. If she dismissed the whispers, she appeared arrogant. Every reaction fed the story they were constructing. A mistress's downfall did not require proof. It required a preference for excitement over fairness. And the court always preferred excitement. Truth lacked drama. Rumor provided endless entertainment. She learned that whispers spread not because people believed them, but because people enjoyed repeating them. Each retelling became a small performance, tailored to the listener's expectations. A noblewoman exaggerated the details to impress her companions. A servant softened the tone to avoid suspicion. A counselor repeated it cautiously, letting the implications speak for themselves. By the time the rumor returned to her ears, it bore almost no resemblance to anything she had ever done. Yet it fit neatly into the court's appetite for scandal. And that was all it needed to thrive. The court did not ask whether the story was true. It asked whether the story was useful. And usefulness was determined by who wished to see her fall. To some, she represented disruption. To others, she represented vulnerability. To many, she represented a convenient target for frustrations they could not safely direct at anyone else. So the rumor grew, not because it was precise, but because it was adaptable. It shaped itself to every agenda, every whispered motive, every quiet grudge. She felt herself shrinking beneath its weight, not physically, but socially, as though each whisper carved away a small piece of her presence. People no longer saw the woman standing before them. They saw the accumulation of stories attached to her name. She wanted to protest, to confront, to demand that anyone, ask what truly happened. But truth required space. Whispers denied her the air to speak. There were nights when she sat alone, listening to the distant murmur of voices drifting through the stone corridors. She could not hear the words, but she recognized the rhythm, the cadence of speculation, the soft hiss of curiosity, the quiet certainty of people enjoying a narrative that was not theirs to tell. She understood that the most dangerous force in the court was not the king's temper, nor the noble's ambitions, nor the queen's disapproval. It was the whisper, small enough to hide in any breath, powerful enough to ruin a life. Her fate, she realized, would not be decided by truth. It would be decided by repetition. Her world now trembled beneath accusations no one claimed. Yet everyone repeated. Each whisper gathered strength, simply because truth arrived too slowly to matter. Some quiet force was already reshaping her fate, proving yet again that rumor thrived wherever certainty failed to defend her. History remembered her with a confidence it had never granted her while she lived. In the pages written long after her silence, she appeared not as the frightened young woman navigating the crushing weight of the Tudor court, but as a figure reshaped to suit the needs of those who survived her. Chroniclers, most of them men, most of them loyal to power rather than truth, described mistresses as disturbers of order, women who lured kings into weakness, who fractured alliances, who tempted stability into collapse. These portrayals hardened into reputation, repeated generation after generation until they seemed factual, even though they had begun as convenient narrative choices rather than evidence. She became one of these shadows in the historical record, not by her own doing, but by the choices of those who wrote after her. A single sentence in a chronicle could undo an entire life. She was troublesome. She brought misfortune. She played her part in the unrest. None of these statements needed detail, context, or proof. They merely needed to be written by someone whose version of events prevailed. And she, like many women before and after her, I had no opportunity to correct the record. Her voice was buried alongside the truth of her experience. While the court's interpretation lived on, she discovered, too late, that being remembered was not the same as being understood. Memory in this world attached itself to whatever made the story more compelling. A mistress was cast as a symbol of temptation, corruption, or folly, not because she embodied any of these qualities, but because such roles simplified the complexities of power. It was easier to blame her than to scrutinize the king's decisions. Easier to paint her as a disruption than to examine the structures that allowed her to be used. Easier to condemn her than to confront the cruelty that shaped her life. In life, she had been frightened, careful, uncertain. In memory, she became bold, reckless, and manipulative. People attributed motivations she had never felt, strategies she had never attempted, schemes she had neither the skill nor the desire to craft. They turned her into the architect of her downfall, as though she had willingly stepped into danger rather than being pushed into it with no means of escape. She became the villain in a story where power protected its own, and blame was assigned to those who could not speak for themselves. Later generations romanticized him, too, in their own way. Artists painted her with sly smiles. Historians described her with an edge of seduction. Storytellers framed her as a catalyst rather than a casualty. But even this seemingly flattering transformation served the same purpose. It erased her. Whether depicted as a temptress or a troublemaker, she remained trapped within roles chosen for her by others. Rarely did anyone ask what she might have felt as she stood alone in her fading chambers, or how she endured the silence that closed around her after her fall. Pain did not survive in historical memory unless it could be woven into a larger tragedy worth retelling. The truth of her life was ordinary, fragile, and human. Precisely the kind of truth history discarded most easily. She had been a girl raised in a world that offered her few choices. She had been lifted into danger by a glance she did not seek. She had been destroyed by whispers she could not challenge. None of this fit the grand pattern chroniclers preferred. So none of it remained. They preserved only the pieces that served their narratives, leaving behind a distorted outline that bore little resemblance to the woman she had been. It was not malice that shaped this remembering. It was indifference. Indifference to her suffering, her silence, her disappearance. Indifference to the families who lost daughters to the ambitions of powerful men. Indifference to the way the court consumed women like her without ever acknowledging its role in their destruction. History cared for triumphs, treaties, vase, and lineage, not for the quiet tragedies hidden behind chamber doors. She became another example in a long line of women whose stories were written by those who had never listened to them. Her name, if it appeared at all, carried the faint echo of disapproval. She was the caution, the footnote, the implication. And in this way, the narrative ensured that future readers would see her as the problem, not the system that had shaped her fate. No one wrote of her tenderness. No one recorded her fear. No one chronicled her longing for a life beyond the walls that consumed her. These truths, unprofitable and deeply human, dissolved with her silence. Her memory endured only in the shapes others carved around her absence. Every retelling reinforced the roles she never chose, but was forced to inhabit long after she was gone, somewhere beyond those written lines. The truth of her life remained untouched, waiting for a world willing to hear what history never bothered to ask. Her disappearance did not end with her. It moved quietly through the years that followed, settling into the walls, the corridors, and the hushed conversations of the Tudor world. Long after her name had been softened into rumour or erased, the shape of her fate remained as a warning, unspoken yet unmistakable, to every woman who stepped into the spaces she once occupied. The silence surrounding her story lingered like a cold draught in the corners of the household, teaching those who watched that sometimes survival meant knowing when not to be seen, not to be remembered, not to be heard. Young women entering court service felt this presence before they understood it. They learned to lower their eyes at the right moments, to speak softly enough that their words could never be used against them, to carry themselves with a careful balance of modesty and obedience. They sensed that a single misstep could shift the trajectory of their lives, not because of anything they did, but because the world around them preferred simple explanations and easy sacrifices. Her story had become part of the unspoken curriculum, an inherited fear passed down not through instruction, but through the tense, watchful behavior of the women who survived longest. Men, meanwhile, absorbed a different lesson. They saw how swiftly a life could be reshaped, rewritten, or removed when it threatened the structure that protected them. Power became easier to maintain when its consequences were invisible. They understood that the threat of silence, of erasure, was often more effective than punishment. A woman did not need to be condemned in public if she could simply vanish from relevance. This quiet method preserved reputation, preserved order, and preserved the authority of those who oversaw both. Her fate reinforced the idea that men decided which stories mattered and which ones dissolved. Generations of families, too, felt the echo of what had happened to her. A daughter drawn into a king's attention meant danger as much as promise. A whispered compliment from a nobleman could bring pride and dread in equal measure. Parents who had once hoped for advancement now feared it, knowing how easily a household's future could collapse if a girl's beauty or presence drew the wrong kind of interest. The burden of her history settled onto them through caution that guided their behavior, their choices, their ambitions. In this way, her suffering became a tool for shaping a wider social order. Even the court, with all its ornamented display and carefully constructed decorum, carried the imprint of her absence. Ladies-in-waiting studied the downfall of women like her to refine their own survival strategies. They learned to move through rooms without drawing attention. They learned to observe before speaking. They learned to measure their smiles, weigh their gestures, and conceal their true feelings beneath the calm exterior demanded by their surroundings. A mistress's downfall reminded them that visibility was not the same as security, and favour could turn into danger with no warning at all. Her story, if it could even be called hers, served to reinforce a hierarchy that had existed long before she entered it. Those above her maintained their comfort by ensuring that no one questioned the rules. Those around her learned that punishment could arrive without cause or explanation. Those below her understood that the throne's reach extended further than they had imagined. She became both an example and a reminder. Power required sacrifices, and someone would always be chosen to bear them. Yet beneath all of this, another truth remained. The women who came after her did not forget. Even if they could not speak openly of what they remembered, they carried her story in glances exchanged across a chamber, in the careful folding of linens, in the subtle caution of their steps. They recognized the shape of her suffering in their own daily limits. They saw how easily affection, admiration, or beauty could become weapons against them. Her life became part of their quiet understanding that the world did not change simply because someone had been wronged. Her legacy, was not in the chronicles that erased her, but in the silent resilience she left behind, in the way women learned to read danger where others saw possibility, in the way they supported one another without daring to be obvious, in the way they held on to their small acts of endurance. Even if history did not honor her, the unspoken community of women who followed her carried forward the knowledge carved from her suffering. Her absence continued shaping the choices of those who feared sharing her fate. Her story lingered where no official record cared to look, a quiet force that trained women to survive the world that consumed her. Another unseen trace remained beneath the polished surface of the Tudor court, carrying forward the part of her life history never bothered to preserve. Chosen by a glance she never sought. She reached the final stretch of her story with a stillness that no one around her cared to examine. The Tudor court, with its relentless need for order and caution, no longer spared her even the small courtesy of curiosity. Once, her presence had stirred whispers of admiration, jealousy, and speculation. Now, the only sound that followed her was the quiet scrape of her own footsteps as she walked through corridors where her name had already begun to fade. The women who passed her avoided meeting her gaze. The men who once summoned her with a gesture now behaved as though she existed on another plane entirely. Visible, but irrelevant, like a shadow cast by a dying flame. She understood then that endings in this world arrived not with declarations, but with disappearance. There was no final audience, no moment of reckoning, no explanation offered in a trembling voice. Instead, the court simply reshaped itself around her absence. The way stone absorbs the cold without complaint. She stopped receiving invitations. She stopped being acknowledged in morning gatherings. Her seat at the edge of the hall remained empty until someone quietly removed it, and no one noticed the moment it vanished. For a woman in her position, this procedure was not unusual. The court preferred endings that did not leave marks, ones that placed the burden of comprehension on the woman who was removed, rather than on the world that cast her aside. In the stillness of her final days within those walls, she found herself rehearsing words she would never speak. They collected in her lungs like breath held too long. Fragments of explanations, confessions, denials, and small memories she feared would die with her. But there was no one willing to listen. Even those who might have shown sympathy kept their distance to protect themselves. Association, after all, carried its own dangers. She had become a symbol of instability, a cautionary figure who had stepped too close to a source of power she could never truly wield. Now she paid the price the court believed appropriate. Isolation so complete that it felt like watching her own life from a distance. She remembered the beginning with a clarity that felt almost cruel. The glance that had lifted her from obscurity had seemed harmless at the time, empty of threat, full of possibility. She had not understood then that such a moment marked the start of a path without return. She had once been just another young woman learning her place among the complicated hierarchies of the court. Then, without warning, she had been chosen, and being chosen had reshaped every breath she took. She learned to move with grace, to speak with care, to mask her fear beneath a practiced calm. Yet none of those precautions had saved her. The court took what it wanted and withdrew when it wished, and she now stood at the quiet edge of that withdrawal. Unseen and unclaimed, her belongings had already been sorted by the hands of others. A gown she had worn during her brief ascent became the property of another woman. Small trinkets she treasured vanished into trunks, not her own. Even her room felt emptied of her presence long before she physically left it. The servants who once greeted her now lowered their eyes so they would not have to recognize what had happened. In a place where reputation governed fate, acknowledging her downfall risked inviting attention to their own fragile positions. She did not blame them. She, too, had once averted her gaze when another woman slipped out of favor, telling herself that silence protected her. Now, she understood the cost of that silence. At night, she sat by the narrow window of her fading chambers, looking out onto the courtyard where torches flickered like drifting embers. She listened to the distant sounds of laughter and music, remnants of a world that had already shut its doors to her. She wondered whether the man who once summoned her with a quiet gesture thought of her now. If he did, it was likely with the vague discomfort one feels when recalling an inconvenience rather than a person. Power did not encourage sentiment. It encouraged efficiency, distance, and the swift removal of anything that threatened its stability. Her downfall served those purposes well. No one offered her farewells. No one asked where she would go. Her departure, when it came, would be treated as a matter too small for record, too delicate for acknowledgement. She would slip out through the same gates she once walked through with trembling hope. But now there would be no escort, no glances, no whispers following her steps. Only the soft sound of fabric brushing stone, and the faint echo of unspoken words dissolving into the air. Her story would not be told by her. Others would shape it as they wished, smoothing its edges, sharpening its flaws, transforming it into a lesson or a warning or an entertainment, depending on who needed it. She would be remembered without accuracy, cited without compassion, invoked without understanding. And in that misremembering, she would lose the final pieces of herself. Yet history accepted this trade without hesitation. It preferred silence over contradiction, myth over truth, and neat endings over the untidy complexity of real lives. Her fate had always been predetermined by forces she could not challenge. Now, as she sat in the dim light of her final night at court, she accepted that no one would rescue her story from the hands of those who would rewrite it. She breathed slowly, letting the cold seep into her limbs, letting the quiet settle against her skin. It was not peace, but it was the closest thing she would be offered. Her exit would pass without farewell, as though she had never mattered at all. Her story, stripped from her grasp, would wander through the mouths of others, reshaped until it scarcely resembled the truth she carried. Her end would be marked not by a voice, but by the soft collapse of silence enveloping the place where her life once stood. Tonight, may your mind drift gently through history's quiet corridors. May the weight of forgotten lives settle softly around you, and may sleep come to you with the tenderness the world denied her. Good night.